He thought he'd just lent out a wrench. He never expected a first-class ticket, a second chance at life, and a woman who would change everything. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The final wrench hit the workbench with a metallic thud, echoing across the silent, oil-stained garage like a sigh. Caleb Reed rubbed the back of his neck, trying to work out the stiffness that had settled in his shoulders after 10 straight hours bent over broken engines. The air smelled of old rubber, rust, and the faint sweetness of antifreeze. Overhead, a single buzzing fluorescent light flickered like it, too, had just about had enough. It was after 7, and the sun had already dipped below the rooftops of the sleepy town of Fairview. Outside, the wind was kicking up dust in the empty lot, nudging rusted soda cans and forgotten bolts like they had somewhere to be. Caleb leaned against the garage doorframe, a rag in one hand, watching the sky change colors. It used to bring him comfort, sunsets like these. Now it just reminded him how little had changed. The bills sat in a neat, accusing stack on the counter behind him. Rent, electric, another letter from the bank he hadn't opened yet. The December cold had crept in early this year, and the space heater in the office coughed more than it warmed. Caleb exhaled, the breath escaping like smoke, and closed his eyes for a moment longer than necessary. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't even unlucky. He just couldn't catch a break. Clients came in, trusted him with their cars, sometimes trusted him with their stories. Divorces, layoffs, cross-country moves. Fairview had no shortage of slow heartbreaks. Caleb listened, fixed what he could, and charged as little as possible without sinking his own ship. He never let on that his own engine was barely sputtering along. In the corner, his old coffee maker clicked off, the last of the day's warmth gone, same as his energy. He moved toward the back, flipping off lights as he went, each darkened section of the garage feeling heavier than the last. Caleb paused at the door, glancing back at the space that was equal parts sanctuary and trap. This was his father's legacy, his own burden, and maybe, just maybe, the place where something good might still happen. He just didn't know it yet. The sky had turned the color of steel wool, thick clouds dragging low over the empty highway just outside Fairview. The kind of day where the wind bit through denim and whispered that snow wasn't far behind. Caleb's old pickup rattled as it cruised along the shoulder, the heater groaning faintly and doing little to warm the cab. He was already late getting home, a bag of clearance groceries sliding across the seat every time he turned the wheel. That's when he saw it. A sleek white car, pulled off to the side with its hazard lights blinking like a slow heartbeat. It looked entirely out of place out here, like someone had parked a spacecraft in a cornfield, low to the ground, chrome trim gleaming even under the gray sky. He could spot the make from 100 yards. German, expensive, not the kind of car you usually saw on County Route 9. And next to it, pacing in the cold, was a woman. She wasn't bundled in a parka like most folks around here. Instead, she wore a long, tailored coat, white of all things, with her dark hair whipping around her face in the wind. She had one hand to her ear, her phone pressed tight, and the other jammed in her coat pocket. Even from the truck, Caleb could see the tension in her shoulders. His instincts wrestled with his schedule. He had promised himself no more delays, no more distractions. But something about the way she stood there, surrounded by too much silence, too far from help, made it impossible to keep driving. He eased the truck to a stop and hopped out, gravel crunching beneath his boots. The cold slapped his face instantly, sharp and unforgiving. "Need a hand?" he called out. She turned quickly, startled. For a moment she just stared, eyes flashing from wary to relieved in an instant. Up close, she looked tired, but collected, like someone who was used to being in control and hated losing it. "I would really appreciate that," she said, her voice smooth but fraying at the edges. "Car just died. Roadside assistance said they'll be at least an hour." Caleb offered a nod and a small smile, already reaching into the back of his truck for his toolkit. He didn't ask questions, didn't need to. Sometimes people just needed help, and sometimes all it took was a wrench and a little bit of warmth on a bitter day. The hood creaked open with a reluctant groan as Caleb propped it up and leaned in, the wind tugging at his flannel collar. The engine looked as pristine as the car's polished frame. No leaks, no grime, no obvious damage. Just a cold machine with a silent problem. He muttered to himself as he worked, his fingers moving without hesitation, muscle memory guiding him through unfamiliar territory with a familiar rhythm. The woman hovered nearby, arms crossed tightly, her breath curling in the winter air. She wasn't offering suggestions or asking questions. She just watched. There was something in her eyes, frustration, maybe, but something deeper, too. A weariness that didn't come from just one bad day. Caleb didn't ask why she was out here alone in a luxury car, dressed like she stepped out of a city catalog. He didn't ask what kind of job she had or where she was headed. Those weren't his business. He'd learned a long time ago that dignity lives in the silence between assumptions. "You've got a loose connection to the battery terminal," he finally said, voice calm and certain. "Probably vibrated loose while you were driving." She stepped forward, peering into the engine like she might see the problem herself. "Can you fix it?" "I've got tools," he replied, already turning toward his truck. He popped the tailgate, pulling out his battered socket set. The box was old, dented, and covered in grease fingerprints, but every piece inside was cared for like gold. As he tightened the connection, Caleb unscrewed the lid on his thermos and poured half into the spare tin cup he kept for customers. The coffee was lukewarm by now, but still better than the biting wind. He handed it to her without a word. She took it slowly, brows raising slightly in surprise. "Thank you." Caleb nodded and kept working, not meeting her eyes. The fix was simple, nothing heroic. But as he closed the hood and dusted off his hands, he felt her gaze linger. She tried to offer money. He declined. She asked for his name. He just smiled. When he climbed back into his truck, the wind howled a little louder, and the sky threatened snow. He didn't expect to hear from her again. Didn't need to. Some people helped because it made them feel good. Others helped because it was the right thing to do. Caleb just helped because that's what you do when someone's stuck on the side of the road. The engine of the luxury car hummed back to life like a purring cat, smooth and effortless, as if it hadn't just been completely useless 5 minutes earlier. The woman behind the wheel looked both relieved and oddly hesitant. Her hands stayed resting on the steering wheel, but she didn't immediately drive off. Caleb stepped back, his hands shoved in his jacket pockets, ready to turn and leave without a word, but she called out to him again. "Wait!" He turned, brows raised. She was already reaching into the sleek center console of her car, pulling out something small and white. A business card. She held it between two fingers, offering it across the window with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "In case you ever need anything, really." Caleb blinked, hesitated for just a moment, then took it. The paper was thick, expensive. He didn't even glance at the print. "Sure," he said, more out of politeness than curiosity. Her gaze lingered, as if she wanted to say something more, but couldn't find the words. Then, with a soft nod, she shifted the car into gear and pulled away, tires crunching over gravel and disappearing down the road like she'd never been there at all. Caleb stood for a beat longer, the card still in his hand. The wind picked up again, slipping under his collar, making him flinch. He climbed into his truck and sat for a second with the engine off, staring at the card now resting on his palm. It felt unnecessary, out of place. People handed out business cards in suits, not after roadside repairs on back highways. He didn't need favors, didn't expect them, and something about keeping it felt awkward. With a small shake of his head, he leaned forward and popped open the glove box. He shoved the card inside, behind an old tire gauge and a stack of crumpled gas receipts. Out of sight, out of mind. He started the truck, the engine groaning its protest as usual, and pulled away from the shoulder. The coffee was still bitter in his mouth, the wind louder now. Just another day, just another stranger, just another engine fixed. He had no idea that the name on that card would soon rewrite every part of his life. The following days bled together in a haze of busted carburetors, oil-slick floors, and the dull ache of too little sleep. Caleb tried to focus on work, on the familiar grind of stripped bolts and overheating engines, but his mind kept drifting, sometimes to that white car and the woman with the tired eyes, but more often to the stack of unopened bills sitting like lead on his kitchen table. Payday came and went without ceremony. The check was smaller than expected, again. Too many customers had promised to settle up next week, and the cost of parts had gone up quietly but cruelly. Caleb deposited what he could, kept just enough to buy groceries, and skipped lunch 2 days in a row without thinking much about it. He'd learned how to make hunger feel like a choice. Emily needed new shoes. The rent was late, and the shop's old compressor was on its last breath, wheezing every time he tried to inflate a tire. One night, after closing the garage, he climbed into his truck and just sat there. The cold had crept in early, and his breath fogged the windshield while the radio played softly, an old country song about leaving town. Caleb leaned back, exhaustion sinking deep into his bones. He reached for the glove box, meaning to grab a spare pen. Instead, his fingers brushed something stiff, smooth. The business card. It slid out onto his lap, still pristine, still unread. For the first time, he looked at it under the glow of the overhead light. Maline Sinclair, Chief Executive Officer. Sinclair Motors Corporation Direct Line. No assistance. Caleb let out a low whistle, staring at the embossed logo, the sleek font, the sheer absurdity of it. CEO. He leaned his head back against the seat and laughed once, not out of amusement, but disbelief. What kind of CEO drove herself through back roads in a designer coat, broke down alone, and handed her direct number to a guy covered in engine grease? It didn't matter, he told himself, probably just courtesy, rich people and their gestures. But still, he didn't toss it. He didn't put it back either. He slipped the card into his wallet next to a worn photo of Emily at her 5th birthday, frosting on her nose, and her smile wider than the cake. Then he drove home, thinking for the first time in days that maybe not all doors were locked. Maybe one just hadn't been knocked on yet. Caleb wasn't the kind of man who Googled people. He barely had time to check the weather, let alone dive into someone else's life. But that night, after tucking Emily into bed and double-checking that her worn sneakers didn't have holes big enough to warrant panic, he sat down with his old laptop and the card still burning a hole in his wallet. He typed in the name slowly, Maline Sinclair. The screen lit up with search results faster than he could blink. Articles, interviews, magazine covers, videos from automotive expos, and keynote speeches. There she was, poised, commanding, striking, standing beside concept cars that looked like they came from the future, posing with international leaders and Fortune 500 executives. In one clip, she shook hands with a famous tech mogul, grinning as reporters snapped photos. In another, she delivered a talk about innovation and sustainability in the auto industry, her voice polished and sharp. Caleb leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised. She wasn't just successful, she was the Sinclair, the one who had taken her father's nearly bankrupt luxury motor company and turned it into a billion-dollar empire, youngest female CEO in the industry, Business Weekly's most powerful woman in tech 3 years running. And her car, that sleek white work of art. He found the model online too, custom built, limited production, valued at just under $300,000. It was worth more than his garage, his truck, and the rundown apartment he and Emily called home combined. He stared at the screen a long time. The woman who had stood on the side of the road in his town, wrapped in a coat and quietly shivering, was global royalty in the business world. He hadn't even known her name. And yet she had smiled at him, talked like a person, not a title, drank his lukewarm coffee, took the socket set from his hands like it meant something, gave him her card, like it mattered. Caleb exhaled, closing the laptop slowly. She wasn't just some lost traveler. She was someone orbiting a world he couldn't even afford to visit, and yet their paths had crossed. He didn't know what to make of that, but he knew it wasn't nothing. The days that followed felt like a fog laced with static. Caleb kept the card in his wallet, tucked between an old grocery list and a folded receipt from the hardware store. He saw it every time he reached for his debit card, every time he counted coins at the gas station, every time he reminded himself to buy Emily's allergy medicine next paycheck. He thought about calling, a dozen times, maybe more. His thumb would hover over her number late at night, after Emily had gone to sleep and the house was wrapped in the kind of silence that made doubts louder. But he never pressed dial. People like her didn't remember people like him. She was probably already back in her world, glass skyscrapers, high-stakes meetings, penthouse apartments where the espresso machine cost more than his rent. And him? He was still here. Still chasing leaks in a rusted Chevy, still patching up a busted exhaust system, with a borrowed welder and too little sleep, still wrapping peanut butter sandwiches in wax paper for Emily's lunch because they were out of Ziploc bags. He'd had customers promise they'd call again. He knew how polite people could be when they didn't want to feel guilty. That card? It was probably just manners, a rich woman's way of saying thank you without ever having to follow through. Caleb didn't hold it against her. He couldn't afford to get distracted anyway, not when rent was creeping up, and his last 3 customers had paid in checks that still hadn't cleared. Not when Emily needed new gloves and the garage's overhead light flickered like it had one foot in the grave. So instead of calling, he worked. He focused. He put his head down and kept moving, like he always did. And still, some nights, he'd catch himself glancing at the phone, wondering what he'd say if she actually answered. But then the moment would pass. He'd sigh, set the phone aside, and tell himself one more lie just to get through the night. She probably doesn't even remember my name. It was Thursday, nearly dusk, and the smell of gasoline lingered thick in Caleb's jacket. He was locking up the shop, palms still sore from a stubborn alternator job that had eaten most of his afternoon when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't expect much these days, maybe a missed call from a supplier or a reminder from the school about Emily's parent-teacher meeting, but this number, it wasn't saved. No area code he recognized. He stared at the screen a moment too long, thought about letting it go to voicemail. Then, against his better judgment, he swiped to answer. "Caleb Reed," he said, out of habit. A pause, just long enough to make him wonder if it was a robocall. Then her voice, clear-measured, almost too calm to be real. "Hi, Caleb. This is Maline Sinclair." His breath hitched. The world around him stilled. "I hope this isn't a bad time," she continued, like she was asking for a minute, not rearranging his entire nervous system. No, it's fine," he said, forcing his voice to sound steady, though his brain was scrambling to catch up. She spoke with a kind of practiced elegance, but it wasn't cold. There was something personal in it. She thanked him again for helping her that day, said she'd been meaning to reach out sooner, but things had been hectic. And then she got to the point. "I'd like to meet again, if you're open to it." Caleb blinked, not sure he'd heard right. "I'm working on a project," she explained. "It's a bit unconventional. It has to do with community partnerships, skilled trades, people like you who still understand the value of hands-on work. I think your voice could matter, and, well, I think we left things a little unfinished." Unfinished. Caleb looked down at his grease-stained hands, the fading sunlight bouncing off the cracked pavement. "Are you sure you've got the right guy?" he asked, half laughing, half hoping she'd say yes. "I'm sure," she said simply, and just like that something shifted. The weight didn't vanish, but it moved, like maybe he didn't have to carry it alone anymore. The envelope came the next morning, tucked between a late utility bill and a coupon flyer for frozen pizzas. It didn't have a return address, just his name printed clean and crisp on the front. Caleb stared at it for a moment before tearing it open, fingers stiff with disbelief. Inside was a sleek folder, a round-trip ticket to New York City, first class. His name printed next to the words Sinclair Motors, guest consultant. And a note, handwritten. Looking forward to your thoughts on the new initiative. Let me show you what we're building. Maline. Caleb stood in his cramped kitchen, the tile cool beneath his socks, the radiator clicking faintly in the background like it was just as stunned. He didn't know how to explain this to Emily, or to himself. By noon, he was on the phone with a kind-sounding woman named Sarah from Sinclair's executive travel team. She confirmed everything: the flight, the hotel, the transportation waiting for him at the airport. "You won't need to bring anything," she said, almost cheerfully. "Just yourself." He hung up, phone still pressed to his ear long after the line had gone dead. By the time the weekend rolled around, he had packed everything he thought might pass for a professional into an old duffel bag. His boots were polished, and he wore the cleanest jeans he owned. The airport was overwhelming. Too many screens, too many announcements, too many people who looked like they belonged there. And then there was the first-class cabin. Leather seats that reclined like dreams, warm towels handed to him like he was someone important, a meal with actual silverware, a flight attendant who called him Mr. Reed like she'd practiced it. He tried not to fidget, tried not to look too amazed, but when the city lights of New York began to sparkle beneath the plane's wing like scattered diamonds, Caleb forgot to act unimpressed. All he could think was how far away Fairview felt, and how strange it was that a roadside fix and a shared cup of coffee had led him to the sky. He had no idea what waited for him on the ground, only that she was the one who brought him here, and that, for the first time in a long while, he felt something flicker quietly beneath the nerves: hope. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, and as the wheels screeched against the runway, Caleb gripped the armrest a little tighter. The man next to him, in a sleek gray suit and noise-canceling headphones, didn't flinch. Caleb, meanwhile, had spent the entire descent alternating between staring out the window and wondering if his flannel shirt looked as out of place as he felt. By the time he stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the noise was already deafening. Voices layered over announcements, the rumble of rolling suitcases, the sharp click of heels on polished tile. He moved through it like a ghost, carrying his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his breath catching in his chest as he took in the scale of everything. JFK made Maplewood look like a bus stop. A chauffeur, yes, a real one, holding a little sign with his name, met him near baggage claim. Caleb didn't even have a checked bag, just his worn-out boots and a jacket, borrowed from a buddy back home who once attended a cousin's wedding in the city. He felt like an actor in the wrong role, like someone was going to come out from behind a column and ask him to leave. The car was black, sleek, and smelled like cedar and money. It whisked him through streets that pulsed with light and motion, weaving through yellow taxis and steam vents and towers that clawed at the cloud. Then came the hotel. A monolith of glass and stone, valets in crisp uniforms, a doorman who called him sir without blinking at his jeans. The name of the hotel was French, or maybe Italian. Caleb didn't dare try pronouncing it aloud. Inside, the lobby was all marble and chandeliers. He stood there for a full minute before the concierge politely reminded him he could check in. His room key came in a velvet sleeve. The elevator had buttons that lit up with a chime so soft it felt like a secret. When he stepped into his suite, the lights came on automatically. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the skyline, the Empire State Building glowing in the distance like something out of a postcard. He dropped his bag by the door and exhaled slowly. This wasn't his world. It wasn't even close. But someone in it had remembered him. And for the first time, Caleb wondered if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as small as he used to believe. The restaurant was the kind of place Caleb had only seen in movies. Low lights, white linen tablecloths, waiters who moved like shadows, and a wine list longer than most novels. He had to double-check his shirt collar in the reflection of the window just to make sure it hadn't curled. Every fork, glass, and folded napkin on the table looked like it cost more than his week's groceries. Then she walked in. Maline Sinclair didn't glide or float like some untouchable icon. She moved with purpose. Graceful, yes, but grounded. Her dark hair was swept back in a soft knot, her black dress simple but impossible to ignore. When she reached the table, Caleb stood halfway out of habit, and halfway because something about her demanded it. "I hope the hotel wasn't too much," she said as she took her seat across from him, eyes scanning his face for signs of discomfort. "It was more than enough," he said with a half smile. "Pretty sure the shower had more buttons than my truck." She laughed gently, the kind of laugh that felt earned, not rehearsed. The waiter came and went like a breeze, and soon a perfectly plated filet mignon sat in front of him. Caleb stared at it for a beat, then picked up his knife like it might disappear if he waited too long. Between sips of wine and bites of food he swore he didn't deserve, Maline leaned back slightly, her tone shifting. "You probably thought I was crazy," she said, "reaching out like this. I thought maybe you hit your head after driving off, yeah?" he said, and she smiled, but her eyes carried something heavier. She looked down at her glass before continuing. "I live in a world where people smile with their mouths but never with their eyes. Everyone wants something, partnerships, headlines, access. No one stops unless there's a motive." Caleb didn't say anything, just listened. "And then I broke down in the middle of nowhere," she said softly. "And someone handed me a wrench and a cup of coffee, no questions, no agenda." Her eyes lifted to meet his. "You were kind without knowing who I was. That kind of thing doesn't just happen anymore." He shifted in his seat, not quite sure what to do with her honesty. "I wasn't trying to be anything, just seemed like the decent thing to do." "Exactly," she said. "That's why it mattered." The candle between them flickered, catching the glint of her earring and casting shadows across her face. For the first time, Caleb realized she wasn't a statue or a headline or a perfect press photo. She was real and tired, and maybe just as lost as he had been feeling. Over dessert, the conversation turned lighter. Stories about his garage, a few about her early days at Sinclair, but something unspoken lingered between them. A quiet understanding, a shared pause in the noise of their separate lives. And when they left the restaurant, stepping into the cool night air beneath city lights, Caleb couldn't help but feel like something rare had happened. Not just a good meal, not just a glimpse into another world, but a moment that neither of them would forget. The elevator chimed as it opened onto the top floor of Sinclair Motors' private innovation hub, a world of glass, steel, and quiet precision. The air smelled faintly of polished chrome and fresh circuitry. Caleb stepped out, boots echoing against the gleaming white floor, feeling as out of place as a wrench in a jewelry box. Beside him, Maline walked with ease, dressed not in glamour, but in quiet authority. A tailored blazer, her hair pulled back, her eyes sharp. She gave him a reassuring glance, as if to say, "You belong here, even if you don't believe it yet." They moved through halls lined with framed patents and archival sketches of past prototypes. Engineers in lab coats and polos nodded as she passed. Caleb nodded back stiffly, hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, trying not to look like he was mentally calculating how much the marble under his feet might cost. Then they reached the heart of it all, the restoration wing. Here the light shifted, warmer, more familiar. Old chassis lined the floor like forgotten legends waiting to breathe again. A cherry-red '68 Shelby, a silver prototype of a car never mass-produced. The hum of power tools mixed with soft music and focused voices. Caleb's eyes lit up. "This," he muttered. "This I understand." Maline smiled. "I thought you might." A young engineer approached with a tablet, eager to explain a new suspension design for one of their reissue projects. Caleb listened politely, arms folded. Then, quietly, he pointed out a flaw. Something subtle, a detail most would miss, but anyone who'd ever fixed a car in the real world would catch. "Too tight a curve here," he said, tracing it with his finger. "Road dust's gonna cake up and seize over time, especially in places with grit-heavy winters. You're gonna want to widen that edge or find a seal that breathes better." The engineer blinked. "That's actually brilliant." A few feet away, a group of Sinclair execs had been watching, murmuring politely. One of them, a man with perfectly combed silver hair, stepped closer. "You've worked with that model before?" "Nope," Caleb said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "But I've worked with the problems that kind of design causes." He wasn't trying to impress anyone. That was the thing. He just saw what they didn't. Maline watched him with quiet pride. She didn't interrupt or guide him. She just let him move from bay to bay, offering feedback that wasn't flowery or formal, just true. The boardroom debrief that followed was short and sharp. They asked for thoughts. Caleb gave them honesty. Not strategy speak, not fluff. Just raw, grounded suggestions that took years of rusted bolts, cracked hoses, and late nights to earn. By the end of the meeting, the room had shifted. No one asked who he was anymore. They were too busy scribbling notes. And as they left, Maline leaned in and whispered, "Told you they'd listen." Caleb didn't answer. He just smiled to himself, a little stunned, a little grateful. And for the first time in a long while, completely certain that he had something valuable to offer a world he never thought he'd step foot in. The garage doors opened with a soft hiss, revealing a car that looked like it had been dreamt into existence. Sleek, muscular, and impossibly elegant, the silver prototype sat under the warm overhead lights like a living memory. Its curves were borrowed from another time. Bold fenders, a long nose, leather stitching so rich it looked hand-woven. But underneath the nostalgia, it pulsed with something modern and quietly savage. Maline stood beside it, arms crossed, a hint of mischief playing at the corners of her mouth. "We call it the Nova 11. It's not on the market yet, still a whisper in the halls." Caleb whistled under his breath. "She's beautiful." "She's also a tribute," Maline added. "Built for people who miss the road more than the destination. People who remember what it felt like to drive for the feel of it." She held out the keys. "Want to take her for a spin?" His hand hovered for half a second before he took them. They were warm from her palm. Moments later, he slid into the driver's seat. The leather hugged him like an old jacket, broken in and familiar. Everything inside was analog leaning, gauges, a smooth shifter, a steering wheel that wasn't padded with buttons but carved like it meant something. The engine roared to life with a low, rumbling purr. Caleb grinned. Not because it was loud, not because it was powerful, but because it responded. The car didn't feel like a machine. It felt like muscle and breath. They pulled out onto the private track behind the facility, and the tires hummed against the pavement like a song he hadn't heard since boyhood. He eased into the first curve, then accelerated. The Nova hugged the road like it was born there, smooth in the bends and urgent in the straights. Maline watched from the passenger seat, her expression unreadable, though the slightest smile tugged at her lips. "This isn't a car," Caleb said after a long moment. "It's a heartbeat." She nodded. "That's exactly what I wanted to hear." They drove in silence for another few laps. No marketing pitch, no distraction, just the growl of the engine and the wind threading through the open vents. When they finally rolled to a stop, Caleb killed the ignition and sat in the quiet hum that followed. "Whoever designed this," he murmured, "they understand something most folks forgot a long time ago." "I had a hand in it," she admitted quietly. He looked over at her, surprised. "I needed to build something real," she said. "Something that reminded me why I ever cared about this business." Caleb didn't speak. He didn't have to. The Nova had said it all. The photo hit the automotive blogs first. Grainy, snapped through a fence near Sinclair's private test track. Caleb behind the wheel of the Nova 11, Maline in the passenger seat, both of them laughing as the car kicked up dust like a beast let loose. By morning, it had a headline. Who's the mystery mechanic beside Maline Sinclair? Caleb didn't notice it until two customers at his garage showed him on their phones, grinning like proud neighbors spotting one of their own on the news. He chuckled awkwardly, brushed it off with a shake of his head, and ducked back under the hood of a truck like he could hide from it. But the story was already out. Within hours, more photos surfaced. Caleb, in his boots and flannel, walking next to Maline through the marble halls of Sinclair's Manhattan headquarters. Another one of them at dinner, seated too close not to raise eyebrows. A final shot of them leaving the restoration floor, heads bent toward each other, mid-conversation. It didn't take long for the speculation to start. Sinclair CEO seen with unknown mechanic, romance or recruitment. Is Maline Sinclair building a new division or a new relationship? From garage to boardroom, who is Caleb Reed? Bloggers reached out. Local news tried calling. A business podcast even emailed a request for an exclusive interview, calling him the voice of the working class. Caleb didn't respond to any of it. He was back in Maplewood by then, shoulders hunched as he rolled tires and checked brake pads. The attention didn't sit easy. He hadn't asked for it, didn't feel worthy of it, and frankly didn't understand what the fuss was about. But the buzz wouldn't fade. Even at Emily's school drop-off, a teacher approached him with a curious smile. "Saw you online," she said. "Didn't know we had a celebrity in town." Caleb gave a sheepish grin and muttered, "Still just fixing radiators, ma'am." But deep down, a quiet tension had settled in. Not because of the fame, he didn't care about that, but because every headline, every question, every blurred photo made him wonder something he hadn't dared ask himself until now. Why did he matter to her? The bell above the shop door jingled a little more often that week, not because more cars were breaking down, but because folks just wanted to catch a glimpse of him. Caleb Reed, the same guy who once bartered a brake job for a dozen farm-fresh eggs, was now the mechanic from the headlines. Maplewood was a town that moved slow and noticed everything. The local diner printed out the online article and taped it to the register, highlighter strokes circling Caleb's name. Mrs. Hutchins from the post office brought him a pecan pie, just because, and old man Jenkins, who hadn't spoken more than 5 words at a time in years, walked into the garage, nodded once, and said, "You clean up nice, Reed." Caleb took it all with a quiet smile, dodging the attention as best he could. But it was Emily who wore the spotlight like a crown. At school she held court at lunch with all the flair of a storyteller. Yes, that was my dad on TV. Yes, the lady was rich. And yes, he fixed her car without even charging her. Her classmates stared wide-eyed as she described the New York hotel. He said it had a view of the clouds. And the prototype car, it was like something from a superhero movie. At home, she asked questions he wasn't ready for. "Dad, are you famous now?" He shook his head, brushing grease off his hands. "No, sweet pea, just helped someone out. That's all." "But she helped you back, right?" He paused, the wrench in his hand suddenly heavier. "Yeah," he said softly. "She did." There was pride in Emily's eyes, pure unfiltered belief, the kind only kids could give. That night, after she fell asleep, Caleb sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at his old flip phone. A new message from a Sinclair assistant had popped up, another invitation, another door opening. He didn't reply right away because while the headlines might be calling him the mystery mechanic, and the world seemed eager to turn him into something more than he ever meant to be, this place, this shop, this quiet town, it still felt like home. And home, for now, still mattered most. The call came on a Tuesday morning, just as Caleb was tightening the last bolt on a stubborn muffler. His phone buzzed in his back pocket, the sound muffled by the steady groan of the garage heater. He wiped his hands on a rag, checked the screen, and saw the name, Maline. He stepped outside to answer, boots crunching through frost. Her voice was warm, steady. She got to the point with her usual grace. "I've been thinking about the restoration division, and I want you to come on as a lead consultant, not just for the Nova project, long-term, full-time." Caleb didn't answer at first. A gull called overhead. A truck rumbled past in the distance. "You still there?" she asked. "Yeah," he said slowly. That's a lot." "I know it is," she said, gentler now. "But you've got something this company's lost. Instinct, truth, hands that know more than spreadsheets ever will. You see the car, you see the people who'll drive it. That's rare." He wanted to be grateful. Part of him was grateful, but another part, quieter, older, clenched up tight. He looked back toward the garage, where Emily's school bag sat near the workbench, her pink gloves tucked into the top. She'd be home in a few hours looking for peanut butter crackers and the latest chapter in their read-aloud book. "How would it work?" he asked. "Would I move out there?" "There's flexibility," she said carefully. "We could arrange part-time in the city and part remote. We'd cover travel, housing, whatever you need." He let out a low breath. "I've got a kid and a life here. It's not much, but it's what we know." "I'd never ask you to leave that behind," Maline said, "but I also don't want you to settle for smallness just because it's familiar." Caleb went quiet. This wasn't just about cars. It was about worth. About stepping into a world where he felt like a guest, not a resident. About trading the grease-stained safety of Maplewood for sleek hallways and corporate lingo that still felt like a foreign language. And deep down, it was about fear. Fear of uprooting Emily, fear of losing himself. Fear that when the novelty wore off, he'd be exposed as just a guy who happened to turn a wrench at the right moment. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "I'd expect nothing less," Maline replied. "Take your time. But just so you know, I don't offer positions like this unless I know the person's already earned it." He hung up with the wind colder than before, and the quiet a little heavier, because opportunity had come knocking. And with it, the terrifying realization that saying yes might cost him everything that had kept him grounded, while saying no might mean walking away from something extraordinary. The garage was quieter than usual that afternoon, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls like it had something to say. Caleb stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, eyes sweeping across the space he knew better than his own kitchen. Dust danced in a single shaft of light, slicing through the grimy front window. Tools hung on pegboards exactly where his father had left them decades ago. Even now, Caleb couldn't bring himself to rearrange them. It felt like tampering with something sacred. This place, this brick and tin shell of a shop, had been his father's heartbeat, a labor of love and stubbornness, built with calloused hands and early mornings, patched together over years with spit, grit, and the kind of pride that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Caleb walked toward the old workbench, dragging his fingers across its scarred surface. He could still hear his dad's voice if he listened hard enough. "Don't chase perfect, son. Chase honest." That's what his father had believed. Cars didn't need to sparkle, they just needed to run. Caleb had tried to keep the dream alive after his father passed, tried to carry the same torch in the same oil-stained boots. But some nights, when the register came up short and the rent hovered like a bad omen, he'd wonder if he was keeping a legacy alive or letting it quietly die in slow motion. Now that legacy had brought him to a crossroads. The offer from Maline wasn't just about a new job. It was a chance to start over, to finally step into something bigger than this town, this shop, these hand-me-down hopes. But this garage, it was in his blood. It was where Emily learned to ride her bike between the lifts, where Caleb taught himself to weld at 16, where his father worked through chemo, refusing to quit until the last bolt was tightened. To leave it behind, even for something good, felt like betrayal. He crouched beside the lift and rested his hand on the cold steel frame. It had held up thousands of cars. It had held him up on days when he thought everything would collapse. And now? It just held questions. Could he walk away from something that never quite gave him what he needed? but always gave him a reason to keep trying? Could he turn his back on the ghosts that still whispered between these walls, reminding him where he came from, even if they no longer had a place to take him? He didn't have the answers yet, but standing there in the heart of his past, Caleb understood something for the first time. Some places shape you, some places hold you, and some places, when the time comes, have to be let go of so you can find out what else you might become. The ballroom was soaked in light, chandeliers dripping crystals like icicles, golden reflections bouncing off champagne glasses, and polished silverware. Caleb had never seen so many tuxedos in one place. He shifted uncomfortably in his borrowed suit, tugging at the stiff collar that felt more like a leash than formal wear. The floor beneath him gleamed like glass, and every movement seemed rehearsed. Graceful servers, clinking laughter, camera flashes that came and went like lightning bugs. He stood near the back, nursing a ginger ale in a crystal tumbler, feeling like an engine part bolted to the wrong frame. Conversations buzzed all around him: venture capital, luxury markets, board expansions, stock shifts, and not a single one of them mentioned spark plugs or torque wrenches. Caleb hadn't even wanted to come, but Maline had insisted. "It's just a dinner," she'd said with a smile. "You've earned a seat at the table." But standing there, surrounded by suits and silk, he wasn't so sure. A couple approached him earlier in the evening, older, polished, the kind who wore their confidence like cologne. The woman had leaned in with a smile too wide to be warm. "And you are—" Before Caleb could answer, Maline's voice cut through the hum like a violin over static. "He's the man who reminded me what integrity looks like." The crowd around them quieted just enough to take note. She was radiant in a deep navy gown, her hair pinned back like a movie star from another era. But her eyes, those eyes found his in a way that pulled him back from the edge. "Everyone," she continued, turning slightly toward the gathering of board members and donors, "this is Caleb Reed. He didn't just fix my car. He showed me that the values we claim to build this company on, honesty, humility, craftsmanship, they're alive and well, just not always where we're looking." A few people clapped. Some smiled politely. A few looked confused. But Caleb, he just stood there stunned, not because she'd said it, but because she meant it. The rest of the night passed in a blur of handshakes and introductions. Maline never once left his side. When people asked what he did, she didn't say, "mechanic." She said, "He's the voice I didn't know Sinclair needed." And for the first time in a room filled with polished exteriors and carefully crafted personas, Caleb didn't feel like a stranger. He felt seen. The gala had faded into low music and half-empty glasses. Somewhere behind the curtains and velvet ropes, the staff began the quiet choreography of clearing plates and folding linens. Outside, the air had cooled, the city exhaling after hours of holding its breath. Maline stood on the terrace just beyond the ballroom's glowing edge, her heels kicked off beside her, one hand resting on the cold railing. Caleb joined her silently, the glass door clicking shut behind him. She didn't turn, but her shoulders relaxed when she heard his steps. They stood there a while, the skyline shimmering in the distance, stars faint above the city glare. "You handled tonight well," she said softly, her voice stripped of its usual polish. "I survived it," Caleb muttered. "Didn't spill anything on my tie. I figure that's a win." She smiled faintly, still looking out. "You know, I used to love these events. The spotlight, the attention. It felt like proof I was doing something right." He glanced at her, waiting. "But lately," she continued, "it's all started to feel hollow, like I'm performing a role I didn't audition for. Handshakes with people who only speak in percentages. Speeches I don't believe in anymore. I built Sinclair up, but somewhere along the way I lost track of why I ever started." She turned to face him then, barefoot, eyes tired but unguarded. "And then there was you. Just some guy on the side of the road. No questions, no small talk. You handed me a wrench and a cup of coffee and went back to your life. You didn't care about my name or my title. You helped me like I was a person." Caleb looked down, unsure what to say. He wasn't used to being someone's turning point. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "But you did," she insisted. "You reminded me of something I hadn't felt in years. That decency isn't transactional, that kindness doesn't need an audience, and that maybe the world I built needs more of your world in it." The wind shifted, brushing her hair across her cheek. Caleb reached out and tucked it gently behind her ear. "I'm not sure I belong in your world, Maline." She held his gaze, quiet and sure. "Then maybe we build one that belongs to both of us." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The city kept blinking behind them, 1,000 lights pretending to be stars. But in that small, borrowed moment of stillness, something real settled between them. Not a gala speech, not a headline, just truth. The next morning came soft and slow, filtered through the blinds of the hotel suite, like the city was giving Caleb a moment to breathe before it demanded anything else. He sat at the edge of the bed in jeans and a plain t-shirt. Hotel slippers still on his feet, holding the phone in both hands. The screen blinked with one name, Emily. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey, kiddo." "Dad," her voice was bright and bubbling. "How's the fancy city? Did you eat anything weird?" Caleb smiled. "Not yet, but I did see a guy walking a dog in a stroller." Emily giggled. "That's so dumb." They talked for a few minutes. About her math tests, about the neighbor's cat getting stuck in the fence again. Nothing big, nothing fancy, just the kind of talk that glued his days together. Then her voice quieted. "Are you coming back soon?" He hesitated. "I wanted to ask you something first." She went quiet, sensing the shift. "What if I took a job here, just part-time? We'd still live in Maplewood, but I'd fly in sometimes. You'd still have your school and your room, but maybe things would get easier." A pause. "Would I get to see the cool cars?" she asked. He laughed. "Yeah, I think we could work that out." Emily was quiet again, then added softly, "I think Grandpa would be proud." Caleb swallowed hard. "Yeah," he said, I think so too." He ended the call and sat there for a while longer, staring out the window at the endless motion of New York life, the swirl of taxis and steam and people who all seemed to know exactly where they were going. Later that day, he found Maline in her office, floor-to-ceiling windows behind her, files open on her desk, but her posture relaxing the moment he walked in. "I'll take the job," he said simply. Her eyes lit up, but he raised a hand before she could speak. "On one condition. I stay grounded. I'm not giving up who I am to chase some version of success that doesn't feel right. I still fix cars. I still go home. Emily comes first, always." Maline stood, walked around the desk, and stopped in front of him. "That's exactly why I want you on board," she said. "Not because you'll fit into this world, but because you'll help reshape it." Caleb nodded, and just like that he said the big yes. Not to wealth, not to status, but to a future that didn't ask him to trade what mattered, only to carry it forward. The move wasn't grand or glamorous. There were no moving trucks with bold logos or perfectly labeled boxes, just Caleb's old pickup with a tarp strapped tight across the back, Emily's school supplies and milk crates, and a duffel bag stuffed with work shirts and the past. Their new place was modest, a second-floor apartment above a bakery in a quiet part of the city, just an hour from Maplewood. The walls were painted a soft cream, the kitchen counters chipped in a few places, and the plumbing made a racket when the hot water ran. But it was warm, safe, and filled with sunlight in the mornings. Emily loved it immediately. Her room had a window that overlooked the bakery's back garden. She picked out a lavender bedspread and filled the bookshelves with the same worn paperbacks they'd read 3 times already. On her first night there, she stood in the hallway, arms crossed, and declared, "I think this place smells like possibilities." Caleb smiled. She always had a way of making things feel brighter. The new school was public, but better funded. with after-school programs and at a library that didn't smell like mildew. Emily fit in faster than he expected, coming home after the first week with a new friend, a folder full of hand-drawn comics, and a flyer for the science fair. As for Caleb, his days started early at the Sinclair satellite garage, an airy, spotless facility tucked behind the main showroom. It wasn't fancy, but it was different. High-tech tools, bigger projects, a team that actually listened. He wasn't the guy fixing busted radiators anymore. He was the guy they asked how to fix them better. And yet, every Friday evening, like clockwork, Caleb and Emily packed a small overnight bag and headed back to Maplewood. Back to the garage with the flickering light, back to the cracked pavement and the worn-out lift that still groaned when it raised a truck off the ground. They'd stop by the local diner, wave to Mrs. Hutchins at the post office, and spend Saturdays walking the old trails by the creek. On Sunday nights, they'd return to the city with a cooler full of leftovers from their neighbors and stories to share. Caleb had found a rhythm, 1 foot in the life he built, 1 in the life he came from. He wasn't trying to be a different man, just a better version of the one who'd knelt beside a broken-down car and offered a wrench without asking for anything in return. He was a consultant, a collaborator, a name on the inside of a company he once could barely afford to buy parts from. But more than that, he was still a father. Always a father first. The Sinclair Restoration Wing took on a new kind of rhythm once Caleb began showing up regularly. Gone were the stiff silences and hesitant nods. In their place came laughter echoing off metal, the hum of classic engines being brought back to life, and the occasional sarcastic quip traded over the hood of a car. Maline had made good on her promise. Caleb wasn't just a token mechanic or a charity gesture. He had a desk, a badge, and a voice in the room. And more than that, she was there, not hovering like a supervisor, but standing beside him with sleeves rolled up, boots on the ground, and eyes full of purpose. They worked late more often than they planned to, nights where the shop emptied, and the two of them stayed behind, tinkering with stubborn bolts, arguing over designs, trading memories like old songs. She'd bring coffee from a boutique cafe down the street. He'd tease her that it tasted like burnt almonds. He brought her diner sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. She swore they were better than anything she'd ever had catered. One evening she stood beside him, holding a flashlight, while he worked underneath the Nova 11 prototype. "You missed a spot," she said. He slid out, grease on his cheek. "Are you supervising or sabotaging?" She grinned. "Depends who's asking." They laughed, and the sound bounced off the steel beams like it belonged there. Like they belonged there. It wasn't just the work, it was the ease. Caleb found himself saying things he hadn't said to anyone in years, about his father, about how scared he'd been to take the job, about Emily and the way she hummed to herself when she was nervous. And Maline, in turn, began to crack open. She told him about her mother's early passing, about inheriting the company too young, about the pressure to always have an answer, even when she didn't. Their hands moved across engines, but their conversations moved through something deeper. Trust. Connection. The kind of closeness that sneaks up on you when you're not trying to chase it. One night, long after midnight, they stood in the dim light of the workshop, wiping their hands clean. Maline looked at him, eyes soft, tired, but alive. "You know," she said quietly, "I never thought I'd feel calm in a place like this." Caleb tilted his head. "Why's that?" "Because it's real, and most of my world isn't." He didn't answer. He just looked at her for a long moment, the silence between them thick with something unspoken. Then she smiled, a small private smile meant only for him. And in that shared quiet, amidst tools and torque and the smell of oil, it was clear. This wasn't just a job anymore, not just a project. There was something else being rebuilt here, something with sparks. It started as a murmur, low, cautious. The kind of conversation carried behind half-closed doors and between sips of espresso in glass offices. A glance too long, a smirk after a meeting, a comment dressed in diplomacy but dipped in disapproval. The board had tolerated Maline's vision for years. They'd applauded her boldness when Sinclair Motors leapt ahead of competitors, riding a wave of innovation and sleek reinvention. But now, that same boldness made them uneasy, because it wasn't attached to numbers or market strategy. It was attached to him, Caleb, the mechanic from nowhere, the outsider who somehow ended up not only at the design table, but also at Maline's side, on tracks, in hallways, at gala dinners, and internal briefings. The boardroom conversations took on a new tone. Is he advising on models or advising her? Are we still making cars or are we writing fairy tales? I'm just saying, perception matters. Investors notice these things. Maline heard the whispers before they ever reached her directly. She wasn't naive. In a world where optics often trumped truth, proximity always came with speculation. She noticed how eyes lingered when she and Caleb laughed a little too long in the hallway. She noticed how questions during meetings began with sugar and ended with thorns. Caleb noticed it too. At first he brushed it off, shrugged at the stares, cracked a joke when someone asked if he was planning to marry into the company. But beneath his humor, there was something heavier. He wasn't ashamed of their connection, not professionally, not personally, but he hated feeling like a shadow creeping into her spotlight. One evening, after a long day at the restoration wing, he found her in her office, reading an email with a jaw clenched tighter than he'd ever seen. "They think I'm compromised," she said, not looking up. "They think you're—" She paused. A distraction." Caleb didn't respond right away. He stepped in, closed the door behind him. "I can walk," he said quietly. "If this is putting you at risk—" "No." Her voice was firm, cutting through the room like steel. "You're not the problem. Their fear is." She stood, crossing the space between them. "They're scared because you don't fit the mold, because you came in here with grease on your hands and didn't ask permission to speak the truth." He looked at her, eyes steady. "And you?" "I'm not scared," she said, "but I'm angry. Angry that they think being close to you somehow lessens me, like decency is weakness." The air between them crackled. "We can't control what they think," he said, "but we can control what we do with it." She nodded slowly. And just like that, they stood shoulder to shoulder, not just against rumor, but against a system that still couldn't understand how honesty, loyalty, and something as unruly as affection could belong in the boardroom without compromise. Because what they had wasn't scandal, it was strength. The boardroom was colder than usual, despite the late spring sunlight streaming through the high windows. The table gleamed like it had been freshly waxed for judgment, and the men and women seated around it looked more like jurors than colleagues. Maline sat at the head of the table, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. She'd been through high-stakes negotiations, investor standoffs, even legal threats. But this was different. This wasn't about product recalls or quarterly dips. This was personal, disguised in professional language. One of the older board members cleared his throat. Gerald Langston. White hair, pristine tie, a voice practiced in corporate cordiality. "Maline, this situation has become difficult to ignore." She didn't respond, just lifted her chin a fraction. "You've built Sinclair Motors into something remarkable," he continued. "But now there are concerns from investors, from longtime partners, concerns that your association with Mr. Reed may be clouding your leadership." A few murmurs followed. Some heads nodded subtly. "It's not about judgment," added a woman to his left. "It's about optics and risk. You're the face of this company. Every headline is yours." Maline leaned back slightly. "You mean the ones about innovation, restoration, and unprecedented customer growth?" Gerald pressed on. "We're asking you to consider what's best for the company's future, and if that means creating professional distance from Mr. Reed, we trust you'll do what's necessary." There it was, the ultimatum dressed in a velvet glove. Choose the company, or choose him. Maline took a breath that felt like it stretched across her entire life. The version of her that had once believed in pleasing everyone had long since faded. The woman sitting here now had rebuilt an empire. But she'd also nearly lost herself doing it. And then came Caleb. He hadn't just fixed a car. He had fixed something quieter, something no balance sheet ever measured. She stood slowly. Her voice was calm, her gaze steady. If this company can't stand beside integrity, it doesn't deserve to lead the industry. The room stiffened. I will not apologize for being close to someone who reminds me what honesty looks like. I will not pretend that kindness, clarity, and a sense of real purpose are weaknesses. Caleb Reed has given more to this company's future than half the consultants you've hired at 10 times the cost. Gerald opened his mouth, but she raised a hand. I know the stakes. I know how fragile public perception can be, but I won't cut off my heart just to make the numbers look better. The room fell silent. I refuse to choose between love and legacy, she said, softer now, but firmer than steel. Because if one can't hold the other, then it's not worth holding at all. No one spoke for a long moment, and Maline didn't flinch, because she knew the cost of pretending. She'd done it long enough. Now she was choosing to lead on her terms, with him, or not at all. Maplewood's main street was dressed in hand-painted signs and paper lanterns, the kind of decorations that weren't perfect, but were made with heart. The town's old community center had been on the brink for months, the roof sagging, the furnace nearly dead. But no one here gave up easily. So they threw a fundraiser. Fold-out tables stretched from the parking lot to the sidewalk, stacked with bake sale goods and homemade raffle baskets. Kids darted between hay bales and face-painting booths, and the smell of barbecue hung thick in the air. A bluegrass trio played from a makeshift stage, their fiddle notes cutting through the evening breeze. Caleb pulled up in his truck with Emily bouncing in the passenger seat, already pointing toward the dessert table. Maline rode with them. She didn't wear designer heels or tailored dresses today, just jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt tied at the waist. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and if anyone in town recognized her from glossy magazines or televised conferences, they didn't let on. They remembered Caleb, and that meant they welcomed her. He introduced her with a quiet pride that went deeper than status. Not my boss, not a guest, but simply, this is Maline. At first she stayed in the background, talking to the church ladies over lemon squares, helping a kid tie his raffle tickets into a jar. She didn't wave a check around or make a speech. Instead, she slipped a sealed envelope into the donation box behind the punch table. No ceremony, no attention. Later that night, when the mayor announced the total raised more than triple the original goal, he said the biggest donation came anonymously, signed only in honor of Emily Reed. Caleb turned to her, stunned. Maline just shrugged. She's the future of this place, isn't she? Emily beamed without fully understanding why her name had been called. She clapped along with everyone else, her smile wide, her hand tugging on Maline's sleeve like they'd known each other forever. The town embraced them both, not with fanfare, but with familiarity, with extra cookies for Emily, with nods of respect from the old-timers, with a place at the folding table like they had always belonged. And as the sky darkened and fireflies blinked in the fields beyond the church, Caleb looked around at the faces he'd grown up with, the ones who raised him, fixed his flat tires, watched him become a father. Now they were watching him build something new. Not just with tools and torque, but with love and legacy, and a woman who saw value in both. The for lease sign was the first thing to come down. Caleb tugged it from the window with both hands, the brittle plastic cracking like old bone. He held it for a moment before tossing it into the dumpster out back, where it landed with a final thud. The garage, his father's garage, was coming back to life. But this time, it wasn't just about fixing cars. Sinclair Motors had offered the seed funding months ago, but Caleb made it clear from the start this wasn't going to be a showroom or a satellite office. This was Maplewood's soil, The floors still held the grease stains from decades of hard lessons, and the walls still bore the nail holes where his dad used to hang tools and Polaroids. And now it had a new name stenciled above the bay doors in bold, clean lettering: Read and Rise Community Garage. Inside, the scent of fresh paint mingled with motor oil and sawdust. Tool chests gleamed beside refurbished lifts. Old handwritten diagrams were framed next to whiteboards. It was a collision of past and future, heritage and hope, humming together like a finely tuned engine. Caleb stood in the middle of it all, watching a group of teens fumble through their first brake job. He didn't bark at them. He showed them. Let them make the small mistakes. Let them wipe their own hands and figure out what a stripped bolt felt like before they learned how to fix it. Some of the kids were from broken homes, some were just lost. All of them were hungry for something real. Maline had visited the shop quietly during its opening week, wearing a Sinclair hoodie and eating chili out of a paper bowl at the back table. She never drew attention to her role in it. She just watched as the town trickled in, neighbors, retirees, local shop owners, all bringing old lawnmowers, busted chainsaws, or their teenage sons who needed something to do after school. Caleb gave tours to anyone who asked. He showed them the apprentice station, the scholarship fund jar, the old locker his dad used to keep spare gloves in. "This place isn't just a garage anymore," he told one visitor. "It's a second chance." On the wall behind the front counter, hung beneath a framed photo of his father in his oil-stained coveralls, was a quote in block letters: "Fix what you can. Teach what you know. Leave no one behind." It wasn't corporate, it wasn't sleek, but it was his. And for the first time since he'd turned a wrench as a teenager, Caleb didn't just feel like a mechanic, he felt like a builder, a mentor, a father not only to Emily, but to anyone who walked through those doors in need of guidance and grease under their fingernails. The garage had been reborn, not as a monument to the past, but as a bridge to everything still worth fixing. The coffee sloshed onto the dash the moment Caleb took the corner too fast. Maline let out a startled laugh, gripping the edge of her paper cup as the smell of dark roast filled the cab. "That cup holder," she said between giggles, "has seen better days." "Everything in this truck has seen better days," Caleb muttered, reaching across her with a napkin. "But she still runs." Outside, the night wrapped around them like a quiet song. They'd left the fundraiser hours ago, escaping the lingering attention with no real plan except to drive. No destination, no deadlines, just a county road, miles of stars, saws, and the warmth of something that had been flickering between them for months. The windows were cracked just enough to let in the cool spring air. The radio played low, some old blues tune that neither of them could name, but both seemed to understand. "Do you remember," Maline said softly, "what you said to me the day we met?" Caleb glanced over, one hand on the wheel. "I said your radiator was throwing a fit." She smiled, then turned to face him more fully. "No, after that. When I offered to pay you, and you told me to pay it forward." He nodded. "Seemed fair at the time." "I did." Her voice dropped. "I just didn't know that what I'd end up paying forward was you." He didn't say anything at first, just let the words settle. The road ahead stretched endlessly, but something between them was shortening, closing. He pulled over at the next overlook, a gravel turnout that faced a wide field and a distant horizon lit only by moonlight. He turned off the engine. The silence between them pulsed like a heartbeat. Maline set her coffee down. "We've both been pretending this is simpler than it is." "Yeah," he said quietly, "we have." She leaned in, resting her head against the side of the seat, watching him. The woman who once paced beside a broken-down luxury car on a cold road now sat beside the man who had offered her nothing but a wrench and a thermos, and everything that came with it. Caleb turned toward her, eyes tired but clear. "I didn't plan any of this," he said. "Neither did I," she whispered. "But here we are." And then finally, they leaned in. The kiss wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was real, warm, familiar in the way only something long-awaited could be. Her hand found his. His thumb brushed the side of her jaw, the gravel under the tires, the rust on the truck, the wind in the trees. It all faded. For a moment, there were no boardrooms, no headlines, no roadblocks. Just two people, tired of holding back and close enough to fall. The idea came, like most of their best ones did, over breakfast. Caleb was flipping pancakes in the tiny kitchen of their city apartment, wearing a grease-smudged T-shirt and humming off-key to an old country song. Maline, still in her robe, sat at the table nursing her second cup of coffee, her hair a little wild from sleep. Emily was sprawled across the couch with a sketch pad, drawing a car that had wings and could shoot stars from its tailpipe. "You ever think," Maline said suddenly, not looking up from her mug, "what would have happened if I'd broken down somewhere else?" Caleb glanced over. "Probably would have ended up with a mechanic who actually charged you." She smirked. "No, I mean, if we hadn't met that day, none of this would have happened." He flipped a pancake, the edges crisping golden. "You saying fate drives a Sinclair Phantom?" "I'm saying," she replied, setting her cup down, "that maybe it was never about the car at all." Later that week, they sat down in her office and mapped it out, on a whiteboard on scratch paper, in the messy way dreams get born. The Drive Forward initiative would be more than a donation. It would be a pipeline, a second chance. They pooled resources from Sinclair's Community Outreach Fund and added a chunk from Caleb's newly revived garage revenues. The goal was simple: full-ride scholarships for underprivileged youth interested in automotive work. But the heart behind it ran deeper. The program would cover tuition for trade schools, mentorship with seasoned mechanics, hands-on apprenticeships in real garages, including Caleb's own shop in Maplewood. Each scholarship recipient would also be paired with a mentor, not just to teach them tools and torque, but how to believe in themselves when the world didn't offer much reason to. By the end of the year, word had spread. National media picked it up. Schools from across the country began reaching out. Community garages in Detroit, Tulsa, Atlanta, places Caleb had only read about, started asking how they could join. The story of the mystery mechanic and the CEO, who found purpose on the side of the road, was no longer just a headline. It was a movement. And at every press conference, every scholarship award, every interview, Caleb stood just a little behind the mic, never seeking credit, just proud. Maline always made sure to pull him forward. Because this thing they'd built, it was bigger than business. It was about showing kids that skill mattered as much as status. That someone with calloused hands and a kind heart could rewrite the rules. That a flat tire, a cup of coffee, and a stubborn mechanic could start something that changed lives. And it all began on a cold roadside, where kindness wasn't strategy, and a wrench was just a way to say, "You're not alone." She was halfway through her day when the envelope landed on her desk. No corporate letterhead, no assistant handing it over. Just a plain white envelope with her name scribbled in Caleb's unmistakable handwriting, half print, half chicken scratch. Maline glanced around, bemused. No cameras, no meeting attached, no subject line. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printed airline ticket, first class. Departure New York City, destination, a small regional airport just outside Maplewood. She smiled before she even finished reading. There was a sticky note attached. "Your turn, C." That evening, she found him under the hood of a dusty Impala at the community garage, sleeves rolled up, the glow of the overhead bulb casting long shadows over his face. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, arms crossed, letting the scent of oil and the sound of old jazz from the radio fill the moment. "You planning to kidnap me?" she asked at last, holding up the ticket. Caleb straightened, brushing his hands on a rag. "Figured it was time you saw where it all started. I've been to Maplewood. Not like this." She raised a brow. "I want you to meet the people who patched my life together," he said, quieter now. The ones who taught me how to hold a wrench, who brought casseroles when Emily was sick, who didn't laugh when I said I wanted to rebuild a dream that wasn't paying the rent. Maline's expression softened. He took a step closer, the rag still in his hands. You've seen my world through restoration projects and press releases, but I want you to see it through the back door of Miss Carla's bakery, through the church potluck where nobody cares what your net worth is, through Emily's eyes, where everything is still magic, even if it's a little broken. She let the paper fall to her side. So this is your big move? She teased. Romance by way of small-town charm? Caleb shrugged, but the corner of his mouth lifted. I just want you to meet the folks who made me who I am, before we talk about who we're becoming. Maline stepped into him, wiping a smudge of grease off his cheek with her thumb. I think I already know who you are, she said, but I'd love to meet the ones who helped make you that way. And just like that, the offer was accepted. Not as a favor, not as a business trip, but as something far rarer. An invitation to step deeper, to trade polished glass for gravel roads, and to walk hand in hand toward something more rooted than either of them had known they needed. It was the kind of evening Maplewood did best, quiet, golden, and slow. The sun had dipped just low enough to cast long shadows across the backyard, and the smell of cut grass lingered in the air. Caleb was inside washing dishes, humming some old tune as the faucet hissed and clinked. Maline sat on the back porch steps with Emily, who was picking at the last crumbs of a brownie from the church bake sale. Fireflies had started blinking lazily above the fence line, and the hum of cicadas filled the space between words. They hadn't planned to talk, but real things rarely wait for the right time. Emily glanced sideways, legs swinging beneath her, as she licked chocolate off her thumb. You know my dad's different now. Maline blinked. Different how? Lighter? Emily said with that matter-of-fact clarity kids are born with. Like he stopped carrying something heavy all the time. Maline didn't answer, just looked out across the yard and waited. Emily leaned back on her elbows, gaze tilted toward the sky. After Mom died, he stopped smiling like he meant it. He still tried, but it didn't reach all the way to his eyes. Maline's breath caught, soft and subtle. But lately, Emily continued, he laughs at dumb stuff again. He dances while he's making pancakes. He sings when he thinks I'm not listening, really badly. That made Maline smile. I've heard the singing. Emily sat up straighter, brushing crumbs from her lap. Her voice turned quieter, more careful. I think that means you're special. Maline looked over, surprised by the weight of it. Because my dad's heart isn't easy to fix, Emily said. But he gave you a piece of it. I can tell. There was a pause, and then, without fanfare, without blinking, Emily added, If you wanted to stay, I'd be okay with that. Maline's throat tightened. She didn't trust her voice, so she reached over and squeezed the girl's hand instead. Emily squeezed back. Just no weird salad with raisins, okay? Maline laughed, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. Deal. Inside, Caleb peeked through the kitchen window and saw them sitting there, bathed in dusk and something gentler than words. He didn't interrupt. He just watched, heart full, knowing that the two most important pieces of his world were no longer orbiting separately. They'd found each other, and maybe, just maybe, that meant they were all home. The garage smelled faintly of motor oil and lavender that day, a scent combination no one expected to work, but somehow it did. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, warming the concrete floor that had seen decades of busted knuckles, falling bolts, and quiet triumphs. But today the old space had traded its rust for ribbons. Caleb stood near the back bay, adjusting the cuff of a shirt that had been ironed twice and still looked like it belonged to a man who preferred grease to starch. His tie was crooked, on purpose. The lift where his father once hoisted his first engine was now adorned with fairy lights and mason jars filled with wildflowers. Instead of pews, there were folding chairs borrowed from the church down the road, every single one filled with someone who had helped carry a chapter of their story. Maplewood neighbors, Sinclair colleagues, a few scholarship students grinning in borrowed jackets. Emily, in a navy dress with boots and a spark in her eyes, stood proudly beside her father. She had drawn the "Welcome to the Wedding" sign in chalk that morning, complete with a little sketch of Caleb handing a wrench to a girl in heels. And then the garage doors rolled open. Maline stepped in slowly, sunlight pooling behind her, dressed in ivory lace that somehow looked just as at home here as it might have in any ballroom. She held a simple bouquet. Her smile held everything else. She walked down the aisle to the hum of an engine, not a traditional song, but the sound of the Nova 11 prototype rumbling gently in the background, the car that started it all. The ceremony was short, heartfelt, and full of the kind of laughter that comes from people who've seen you at your worst and showed up anyway. Caleb looked at her like he was still surprised she said yes. Maline looked at him like she knew she never needed to look anywhere else. "I promise," he said, "to always hand you the right tool, even if you don't ask." "I promise," she replied, eyes gleaming, "to never question your love, your hands, or your habit of singing badly when you think no one's listening." They kissed under the shop lights as the guests cheered, engines revved, and somewhere a slow, happy tear rolled down the cheek of an old mechanic sitting in the front row, whispering, "Your old man would have loved this." Later, they danced between the toolboxes, ate cake off paper plates balanced on workbenches, and toasted to the life they'd built from nothing but timing, kindness, and a cup of coffee. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect. But it was theirs. And as the sun dipped behind the trees and the last dance played on a speaker balanced on a tire stack, Caleb whispered in her ear, "Still think that breakdown was an accident?" Maline smiled, resting her forehead against his. "Not for a second." The auditorium buzzed with the low murmur of anticipation. Parents rustling in their seats, students nervously adjusting microphones, and the faint echo of someone testing the speakers from the wings. It was senior night at Westbrook Engineering Academy, and the final student was already walking to the podium. Emily Reed. Her dark hair was pulled back in a low ponytail, grease still faint under her nails from the after-school robotics club. She wore a navy blue jumpsuit stitched with her name, the same way her dad used to wear his, except hers had patches from competitions and a Sinclair badge she'd earned through her internship. She cleared her throat once, looked up, and smiled. "My name is Emily Reed," she began, "and I want to tell you a story about a wrench." The crowd chuckled softly, unsure where this was going. "A long time ago," she continued, "my dad was just a mechanic in a small town with a daughter, a dream, and a bank account that was almost always empty. He didn't have a big job or a famous name. He just had a garage and a wrench." She paused, letting the silence settle. "One cold morning, he saw a woman stranded on the side of the road. He didn't know who she was, didn't ask. He just handed her his wrench, helped her fix her car, and gave her a cup of coffee. No charge, no fanfare, just a simple act of kindness." Murmurs stirred in the audience. Some had heard whispers of the story before, but never from her. "That woman," Emily said, her voice softening, "was Maline Sinclair, the CEO of one of the biggest automotive companies in the world. And that wrench? It turned out to be the first bolt in a whole new life." She looked down at her hands, then back at the crowd. "Because my dad didn't just help her that day. He reminded her that integrity still existed, that kindness didn't need a contract, and that maybe, just maybe, the right people show up when you're not looking for them." Her eyes scanned the room until they found him. Caleb, now with streaks of gray in his beard, sitting beside Maline, who held his hand like it was still the first day. "Thanks to that wrench," Emily continued, "our town got a community garage, dozens of kids got scholarships, and I got to grow up watching what it means to live with purpose." She smiled, a little crooked, just like her dad. So as I head off to college to become a mechanical engineer, I carry that lesson with me. Not just how to tighten bolts or design parts, but how to show up, how to build more than machines, how to build lives with patience, honesty, and maybe just a little faith in what you can't always see coming. Applause broke like thunder across the room. And somewhere in the back row of a proud memory, the ghost of an old garage and a rusted-out socket set hummed quietly, knowing it had done its job. One wrench, one moment, everything changed.